Luke chapter 20. Luke chapter 20, page 635 if you're using one of the Pew Bibles. Last week we considered the first of three questions the religious leaders asked Jesus. And that question was, who gave you this authority? Who gave you the authority to march into the temple as he did at the end of chapter 19 and throw out the money changers and the buyers and the sellers? And who gave him that authority? Of course, Jesus responds with a question which they can't answer. And then Jesus tells a parable in verses 9 through 16 that we looked at last week. And the conclusion that Jesus came to with that parable was this: the religious leaders' reign over the temple system and all that was coming to an end because they had mismanaged the vineyard God had given them. Now, this, of course, leads to them being enraged, leads to them desiring to remove Jesus, and that leads us to our second question, which we examine today. Are taxes to Caesar lawful? Are taxes to Caesar lawful? So, if you're there in Luke chapter 20, we're going to pick up reading in verse 19. Our text is verses 20 through 26, but we'll read verse 19 on to 26. And the chief priests and the scribes, the same hour, sought to lay hands on him. They feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. And they watched him, and sent forth spies which should feign themselves just men, that they might take hold of his words, and so that they might deliver him unto the power and authority of the governor. And they asked him, saying, Master, we know that thou sayest and teachest rightly. Neither acceptest thou any person of any, but teachest the way of God truly. Is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar or no? But he perceived their craftiness, and said unto them, Why tempt ye me? Show me a penny. Whose image and superscription hath it? They answered and said, Caesar's. So he said unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which be Caesar's, and unto God the things which be God. And they could not take a hold of his words before the people. And they marveled at his answer, and held their peace. There's a movie that came out in 1963. We watched it quite a bit growing up, entitled It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. 4 mads. This movie, has anybody ever seen it? Or remember seeing it roughly at all? Okay. It's about a 2.5 hour, maybe 3 hour movie. It's a long movie. Great movie, though. It opens on a caravan of people, and they are driving, I believe there's in 4 vehicles altogether. They're driving down a California road. And they're all traveling, they're unrelated, all traveling to different places. But what brings them together is they witness a vehicle driving erratically, and eventually the vehicle drives off a cliff, tumbles down the hillside. So these 4 vehicles pull off to a stop, and the men of the group get out, and they make their way down the hillside to the driver, only to find him badly injured. The man, it turns out, was a recently released convict, and with his dying breath, he told them about $350,000. A lot of money, especially back in 1963. Said that there's $350,000 buried in the Santa Rosita State Park underneath a quote-unquote Big W. This man dies. They make their way back up to the road. And they kind of stand around, and basically they all say, Hey, do you think there was any truth to what he said about this money? And they all agree, Nah, it's just the ramblings of some delirious man. Whatever, let's go. And so they all get in their cars and head the same direction toward where they were going. Well, the conversation that ensues within the vehicle of these people proves that they didn't think it was the delirious ramblings of an old man. They believed, we should probably we'll make our way down there and see if we can figure out where this money is. And so after a few miles of everyone driving as though they were uninterested, it becomes clear to everyone that all vehicles are interested in finding this $350,000. So they pull off to the side, they get out, and they hash their group plan together. Okay, we'll all go down there, we'll all find the money, and then we will all split the money equally amongst ourselves. And then, of course, it's like, well, some of us went down to the wreck, and some of us didn't go down to the wreck, and so not everybody, it shouldn't be split perfectly equally. There should be shares for this and that, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so they are never satisfied with how the shares should be divided. Well, then this interaction happens on the side of the road. And thus it ends. Everybody has to pay taxes. And this man is sincere. If we go down and find this money, I mean, I got it. You can't steal from the government. You got to tell them you found $350,000 and paid the taxes on it. I guess that tells you about how spiritual I am, in that I read this passage and the first thing that came to mind was everybody has to pay taxes in this scene from this movie. So obviously he's rather sincere about ensuring we pay the taxes on this money. Of course, the question in our text today is far less sincere. Much less sincere. There's two sections in this passage, and the first one tells us how a plan comes together. The plan comes together in verse 20. They watched him and sent forth spies which should feign themselves just men. They should present themselves as just men, that they might take hold of his words, so that they might deliver him unto the power and authority of the governor. And they asked him, saying, Master, we know that thou sayest and teachest rightly, neither acceptest thou the person of any, but teachest the way of God truly. Is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar or no? And so the plan comes together. It was a threefold plan. First part of the plan, send in the spies. The religious leaders have began watching Jesus. So likely what happened, if you remember back to chapter 45 at the end there, it says Jesus taught daily in the temple. And so Jesus is teaching in the temple on a daily basis, and likely in the course of his teaching, he received questions, gave answers from all the people in the temple as questions arose and whatnot, and that's just the typical practice of how it would have gone. And as they're watching him, it dawns on the religious leaders, we tried to oppose Jesus face to face, but it didn't work. What if we send someone into the crowd that looks like the crowd, that acts like the crowd, that presents themselves as one of the crowd, just an honest Jewish man in the crowd that desires to have Jesus answer a question for him? A trick question. A question that would prove Jesus is wrong. And so they come up with this plan. And into the crowd the spies are sent. And it seems to indicate that they sent multiple people, not knowing who was going to be able to ask the question. These men put on a facade. They feign being righteous, being godly men. But they were nothing of the sort. Now, last week I told you that the goal, for the most part, was to get Jesus to perjure himself before the crowd. Today, it adds to that. Now they either want Jesus to perjure himself before the crowd, or to say something against the Roman government, and then they can remove him that way. Either remove him because he loses the favor of the people, or remove him because he speaks against the Roman government. Particularly the governor, Pontius Pilate. In other words, there are two mottos of the religious leaders in Jesus' day. There's more than one way to skin a cat, and two, if at first you don't succeed, try again. So they break out the flattery. Teacher, master, we know you. There's no way. You only say what is right. You only say what is true. You don't show partiality to any people. You're no respecter of persons. You teach the way of God in truth. So we know that there's no way you're going to tell us what's wrong here. You're going to give us a direct, clear, truthful answer one way or another. Flattery. Who wouldn't like to hear those words? Who wouldn't like to be lauded about how great and how truthful and honest and perfect that they are? But the point of the flattery is this. We trick Jesus, we get Jesus in his head, we get him puffed up with pride. That way he thinks he's all something. It kind of clouds his judgment, clouds his mind. Then we ask the question, and he misanswers the question. He falls into a trap. And so they seek the answer slyly. Because you're so truthful, tell us, is it lawful that we, the Jewish people, Israelites, the seed of Abraham, God's chosen people, is it lawful that we would have to pay taxes to Caesar, the Roman government, a Gentile, not God's chosen people? Is it lawful that we should have to pay taxes to them? And so if Jesus were to respond, yes, you are to pay taxes to Caesar, well, that would immediately cause a rumbling among the crowd. Who does he think he is? We shouldn't have to pay taxes to Caesar. We're God's chosen people. They detested paying taxes to Rome. The perspective of the Jews was this: we're God's chosen nation. We shouldn't be subject to anybody but God. Now, of course, there's a great irony in their determination of that, is because they had that option. God had told them, if you will follow me, if you will obey me, if you will keep my commandments, I will be your God, and you will be my people. And all these blessings will come upon you. But if you reject doing that, if you reject obedience to me, if you do not keep my commandments, I will allow you to fall into subjection to other nations. And so it's rather ironic that they had the ability to be free, and they complained about paying taxes to Rome because they weren't free, but they're the ones that had chosen that. They chose to reject God, and therefore they chose bondage. Now, the other hand is this. If Jesus responds and says, oh, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. That's not what you should be doing. You Israelites should not be paying taxes to the Romans. Well, then the people would laud him. But of course, the religious leaders would instantly march up. They'd grab Jesus. They'd haul him right on down to Pontius Pilate. And they would say, hey, this guy's leading an insurrection. He's trying to subvert the people against the Roman government by saying you don't have to pay taxes to Rome. So it's a great plan. And the execution goes off perfectly for a while. But in verses 23 to 25, we see a plan fall apart. Because it says, Jesus perceived their craftiness, and said unto them, Why tempt ye me? Show me a penny. Whose image and superscription hath it? They answered and said, Caesar's. And he said unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which be Caesar's, and unto God the things which be God's. And so a plan falls apart, because Jesus first perceives a trap. The Greek word that Luke uses there in verse number 23, craftiness, it means readiness to do anything. In other words, the religious leaders were so willing to move all standards, move all honesty, move all decorum, move all truth. They were willing to take all of it and throw it away just so they could trap Jesus. But there's good news here. The schemes of deception that have been going from the beginning of Mark to the end of John, where they asked him question after question after question, all these schemes to trick Jesus and trap Jesus into saying the wrong thing, they never ever work. All throughout his life, he beats them at their own game. He could see the questions, and most of all, he could see the motive behind the question. Didn't you hate it as a child? Or if you are still a child? Or as a parent thinking back to having your children? How you could plan and you could structure a request just so perfectly. And you could know exactly how to say it to get your parents, they have to say yes or no. There's no way that they're going to be able to figure out, I have an ulterior motive here. And then you go and you present that to your parents, and guess what? They call out your motive immediately. Or your kids came to you and you called out their motive immediately because you could see through to see what was behind it all. I hated that. I'm sure my kids hate that. The adult religious leaders of Israel have resorted to a child's game to try and trap Jesus. Their quest to retain authority was failing spectacularly in front of all the people. Everyone could see how badly they were doing at this. Jesus asked a question. Show me a penny. This is the word denarius. Show me a denarius. Various degrees of belief on what a denarius was. I believe the greatest consensus is a denarius was approximately 1 day's wage. And when a nation took over, and I should say, the starting tax by the Roman government was denarius. That was the beginning of the tax. That was the lowest tax bracket you fell into. When a nation took over another nation, they would implement and they would command adherence to using their currency. In other words, the Galilean currency or the Jerusalem currency or the currency of anything else was not acceptable and not suitable to pay your Roman taxes. If you had Roman taxes to pay, you had to pay with Roman currency. Thus, by being forced to pay your taxes with a coin that showed Caesar's imprint on it and Caesar's name on it, by handing that in to pay your taxes, you're saying, I am subject to him. I am his subject. And the farther the coinage of a given nation spread and was in use, generally determined how vast and strong and superior that nation was, the extent of their kingdom. And so Jesus asked, well, that Roman denarius, whose image is it? And they say, well, it's Caesar's. Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor. And so with that evidence, Jesus prescribes a verdict. Well, okay. Then render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render to God that which is God's. And I find it amazing that this verdict is still used today. It is passed through, even unreligious circles use this phrase to talk about things. The meaning of it is this: there are some things that are directly and fully within the realm and power and authority of Caesar, or the king, the president, the government. And there are other things that Caesar has no power and no authority whatsoever to take care of in any way, because those are in God's authority, His realm. And so, as an Israelite, you submit to Caesar. Caesar says pay your taxes, you pay your taxes. Because Caesar can demand that. God put him in that position. You submit to his civil authority. However, though you may be in Israel, and though you may submit to Caesar, as one whose faith is placed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you submit to God in the realm of that which belongs to God. And of course, that leads us to ask what question? Well, what does belong to the realm of God? And I suppose we could go down the rabbit hole of this belongs to the civil government and this belongs to God, but we'll boil it right down to the primary concern, I would believe, of this text. And that is this: worship. Your religious worship. That is solely within God's realm. Completely. And therefore, in that realm, Caesar has no authority. So Caesar can give you coins with his image and his name on it, and he can say, you will pay taxes to me, and you will worship me. And you will pay taxes to him, but you will not worship him, because that's not his authority. That's not his realm. He doesn't get that. That goes to God. And so this verdict is perfect. There's not going to be a retort to it. And hence why verse 26 says, they could not take hold of his words before the people. They couldn't find any fault with what he said. They marveled at his answer. They held their peace. This plan that had come together so perfectly has fallen apart. Their attempts to destroy Jesus' authority, his standing before the people, have fallen flat on its face. Now, verse 27 tells us, but the Sadducees were discussing things amongst themselves, and we'll get into who they are, and they come up with a question that they present to Jesus, and that's what we'll look at next week. So, number 3, let's consider this: a plan for us. A plan for us. First, there is a warning in this passage about hypocrisy. There's 2 considerations regarding hypocrisy in verses 20 and 21. There's the scary situation where men pretend to be something they are not. They present themselves, we are just, we are righteous, when their actions prove they were anything but just and righteous. So there's a warning here for us about being cautious about presenting ourselves as one thing when we are not that thing, trying to trick others into believing we are something we are not. But there's a second consideration about hypocrisy in verse 21. And I believe this is even a worse aspect of hypocrisy. And that is this. In verse 21 they say, Master, we know that thou sayest and teachest rightly, neither acceptest thou the person of any, but teachest the way of God truly. Everything that they said to Jesus was true about Jesus. It was right about Jesus. And yet here's the dangerous part. It was devoid of any sincerity and any belief on their part. Their insincerity was hypocritical. It was terrible to present themselves as one thing when they were another thing, but it was vile of them to talk about how true and how honest Jesus was when they themselves were empty of any truth or honesty at all. And so a warning about hypocrisy, and then a word about hiding. Jesus was not simply a good guesser. He was God. Hence, his ability to see through and to see the motive behind the question. And thus I would say that an application we might draw is this. we would do well to consider the motive behind our questions, our requests. It may be the most clearly evidenced in prayer when we make a request of God, but we should also consider our actions and reactions toward others. Is the motive behind why we give simply to get? Is the motive behind our worship simply to be seen of others doing so? Is the motive behind preaching simply to be lauded by the congregation and patted on the back? Is the motive behind our Christian service simply self-serving? What the Bible says about this type of stuff is that all the wood, hay, and stubble will be burnt up. All that is done for self, all that is done for God, the gold, the silver, the precious stones, will withstand and remain. And so there is that warning about hypocrisy and a word about hiding, but those aren't really the point toward the passage. Those are applications we might draw from them, but they're not necessarily sticking out to us. The application of the passage is what Jesus said. Render therefore unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. And so we have the third thing, the wisdom about honor. Paul discusses this governmental authority at great length in Romans 13, and he says there, render therefore to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Jesus' answer to a disingenuous question by hypocritical men, which was provided to them by vile religious authorities, his answer reminds us, Christians, we're citizens of two countries. We are citizens of heaven, and we are citizens of earth. And we must hold in balance our citizenship. In regard to balancing this, Bruce Larson says it this way. He says, Jesus says to make a choice is too simplistic. In other words, is it lawful for us to give tribute and pay taxes to Caesar? Is that lawful? Well, there's not simply a yes or no answer to that. That's too simple. It can't be boiled down to a yes or no answer. And he continues, he said, Jesus shows two sides of the coin. We have to live in both worlds. We have a duty to our nation, however we interpret that, and we belong to God. We must live responsibly with both loyalties. In other words, it's not necessarily one or the other. It's not pay taxes because I'm Caesar's subjects or don't pay taxes because I'm God's subject. It's both. Both at the same time. It is not antithetical to religious duty to render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Rather, it is a part of religious duty to render to Caesar what is Caesar's. So therefore, when we are commanded by the government to pay taxes, we do that because that's the government's realm. That's the authority they've been given. You render to Caesar what is his. Now, I understand we can go down a rabbit hole and spend hours debating and look at all the passages about how far is the government allowed to go, what's too much, what's ridiculous. We can go through that whole rigmarole, but that's not the desire or goal of this passage. Jesus' answer, however, does raise a concern. And the concern is this. We could be tempted, or we could even be commanded to render to Caesar that which is not Caesar's. And therein is a problem. What might we render to Caesar, to the government, to the president, to the king, that is not his, but is exclusively God's alone? Worship. In that instance, there is no debate. Because we will not allow the realm of Caesar to take away from our worship of God. And we will not let them take part of the worship of God. And we will not allow the government, we will not allow Caesar, we will not allow the king, we will not allow the president or the princes. We will not consent to them taking the place of God's worship at all. Though they may command it, we will not obey it. Why? Because we worship God. And we worship God alone. And God has revealed himself to us in Jesus Christ, his Son. Hence why when we gather every week, we don't gather to proclaim the glory of the government, or the king, or the president, or the Caesar, or the governor, or any mayor, or any other government official. No, we don't gather for any of that. We don't put any trust in princes, as we looked at a few months ago. We gather to proclaim what? The glory of God. We gather to do what Psalm 92 said. Praise his name. To show forth his loving kindness in the morning and his faithfulness every night. To declare his righteousness. To show his justice. We do it forevermore. And that is why we sing songs like I Cast My Mind to Calvary, where Jesus bled and died for me. I see his wounds, his hands, his feet, my Savior on that cursed tree. His body bound and drenched in tears, they laid him down in Joseph's tomb. The entrance sealed by heavy stone, Messiah still and all alone. Then on the third at break of dawn, the Son of Heaven rose again. O trampled death, where is your sting? The angels roar for Christ the King. He shall return in robes of white. The blazing sun shall pierce the night, and I will rise among the saints, my gaze transfixed on Jesus' face. And then the chorus, what? Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Don't praise the government. The government's not a part of that. Not the government's role. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. O Lord, our God. In other words, we will render to Caesar what Caesar is due. But when it comes to God, we will not render to God what is Caesar's. We will render to God what is God's. We will not give Caesar what is God's. We will give it to God. I will sing of my Redeemer and his wondrous love for me. Let's pray.